My son called me. I am getting married tomorrow, Dad. I withdrew all the money from your bank accounts. Oh, and I sold the house. The new owners arrive in the morning. Bye. I stared at the black screen of the phone. Most fathers would cry. Most fathers would scream, beg, or call the police in a total panic. I just sat there in my wheelchair and laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound in the empty room. My dear son Bradley did not know one tiny, critical detail. That house he just sold to a highly dangerous buyer did not actually belong to me. And the war he just started was a war he was destined to lose before the very first shot was fired. The silence in the Hamptons mansion was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that usually comes after a funeral, not the day before a lavish wedding. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic Ocean was a slate of angry gray, churning against the shore with the exact same violence that was currently twisting in my gut. I sat in my wheelchair, my hands trembling slightly on the armrests. Not because I was weak, but because the adrenaline was finally flooding my system after months of calculated dormancy. The phone lay on my lap like a dead weight. Bradley's voice still echoed in the cavernous living room, stripped of the expensive art and the antique rugs my late wife Catherine had loved so much. He had been quick, I had to give him credit for that, ruthless and quick. Dad, listen to me, he had said, his voice rushing with a manic energy I had never heard before. Vanessa and I need the startup capital. You are not using it. You are just sitting there rotting in that chair. I used the power of attorney you signed last month. The retirement accounts are completely empty. The investment portfolio is entirely liquidated. It is about $500,000. He had paused then, waiting for me to slur a pathetic protest, waiting for the helpless stroke victim to beg. When I said absolutely nothing, he delivered the final devastating blow. And the house, I found a cash buyer, a private equity group. They paid $1.5 million. It is below market value, but they offered immediate liquidity. They want full possession tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You need to pack your things, Dad. I booked you a room at the Shady Pines facility in Queens. It is paid for a month. After that, you are on your own. Do not come to the wedding tomorrow. You would just embarrass us. The line had gone dead. No goodbye, no I love you, just the cold, metallic click of a connection permanently severed.
I looked around the massive room.
He had already sold the furniture last week, claiming he was decluttering the space for my physical safety. Now I finally understood. He was liquidating my life piece by piece, stripping the flesh from the bone, until there was nothing left but a useless skeleton he could discard in a state-run nursing home. I closed my eyes and let the memories of the last 3 months wash over me. It had been the hardest, most grueling performance of my entire life. Harder than any undercover audit I had done for the FBI in the 1980s. Harder than looking a cartel boss directly in the eye and telling him his books were clean while wearing a wire. 3 months ago, my wife, Catherine, died. She was the brilliant light of this house, the only thing that kept the inherent darkness of my profession at bay. When she passed, the silence she left behind was deafening. But it was in that exact silence that I began to hear other things. Whispers. I heard Bradley talking to Vanessa in the hallway immediately after the funeral. He is old, Vanessa had hissed, her voice low and incredibly sharp. He is going to spend it all on nurses and doctors. We need that money now, Bradley. My brand is launching next month. He won't last long. Bradley had replied coldly. He is weak. We just need to get control. That was the exact moment the doubt settled in my heart. A father never wants to believe his son is a monster. You desperately want to believe that the boy you taught to ride a bike, the boy you paid through college, the boy you bailed out of trouble more times than you can count, actually loves you. But I was not just a father. I was a senior forensic auditor. My entire career was built on finding the brutal truth hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. I knew that people lie all the time, but numbers do not. And the numbers of Bradley's affection were absolutely not adding up. So I devised a test, the ultimate audit of his character. I faked it. I staged a mild stroke. It was not particularly difficult. I knew the symptoms perfectly. The slight facial droop, the slurred speech, the profound weakness on one side of the body. I spent a week in the hospital, letting the doctors run expensive tests that came back entirely inconclusive, attributing it to severe stress and advanced age. When I came home, I fully committed to the role. I sat in this wheelchair, I let my hand shake violently when I held a cup of coffee. I let soup dribble down my chin, while Bradley watched with a look of pure disgust he didn't even try to hide. I became the pathetic burden they said I was. And then, I handed him the loaded weapon. The power remembered the day I signed it. It was raining, much like today. Bradley had placed the legal document on the table in front of me. "It is just for emergencies, Dad," he had said, his eyes shifting nervously away from mine. "Just so I can pay the medical bills if you get worse. You trust me, don't you?" I had looked at him, desperately searching for a trace of the little boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. I searched for hesitation. I searched for guilt. I found absolutely none. I only found naked greed, reflecting the cold ambition of the woman waiting in the car outside. I signed it. My signature was incredibly shaky, a perfect imitation of a man completely losing control of his mental faculties. I gave him the gun, pointed it directly at my own chest, and waited to see if he would pull the trigger. Today he pulled it. He did not just pull it, he emptied the entire clip. The wind howled fiercely outside, rattling the heavy glass panes. I looked down at my legs. They had been still for so long that they felt heavy, like lead. But they were strong. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale air of the empty house. "It is time," I whispered to the empty room. I gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. My knuckles turned stark white. With a grunt of effort, I pushed. I stood up. I stood tall. My spine straightened perfectly, the pathetic slump of the invalid vanishing instantly. I stretched my neck, hearing the highly satisfying crack of vertebrae realigning. I walked confidently to the window, my stride long and purposeful. The limp was gone. The tremors were gone. The old, confused man who supposedly needed help using the bathroom was entirely gone. In his place stood Garrison, the man who had brought down massive Ponzi schemes and systematically dismantled international corporate fraud rings. The man who had been genuinely feared in executive boardrooms across Manhattan. Bradley thought he had effortlessly robbed a senile old man. He had absolutely no idea he had just stolen from a wolf in sheep's clothing. I turned away from the window and walked across the expansive living room to the library. The shelves were completely empty, the rare books sold off in boxes for pennies on the dollar by my greedy son. But he had completely missed the most important thing. He was lazy. He only ever looked at the surface. He saw old books and saw $5 a piece. He never bothered to check the structure of the room. I walked to the mahogany paneling on the far wall. I pressed my thumb firmly against a knot in the wood that was slightly darker than the rest. A section of the paneling clicked heavily and swung open, revealing a titanium steel safe deeply embedded in the wall. Bradley knew about the wall safe in the master bedroom. He had aggressively emptied that weeks ago, taking Catherine's heirloom jewelry and my vintage watch collection. He thought he had found the treasure. He didn't know that was just the decoy to keep him satisfied. I punched in the code to the hidden library safe. Catherine's birthday. The heavy door swung open smoothly. It was completely empty of cash. I didn't keep cash here. Cash was for amateurs inside. There was a single thick red file folder and a cheap, disposable burner phone. I took the file and the phone. I walked to the kitchen island, the only piece of furniture too heavy for Bradley to quickly sell. I opened the file. Inside were the documents that defined my true life. The property deeds, the irrevocable trust agreements, the real bank accounts that the power of attorney could not legally touch. And the surveillance reports. I had not just been sitting in that wheelchair, staring at the wall for 3 months. I had been watching. I had hired Blackwood, my oldest friend and the most vicious attorney in New York, to watch them. I flipped open the phone. It had one number programmed into it. I pressed call. It rang once. Twice. Garrison Blackwood's voice was gravelly, sounding like tires crunching on a gravel road. "Is it done? The fish has aggressively taken the bait," I said. My voice was strong, resonant, the voice of a commander giving an order. "He drained the decoy accounts, $500,000, and the real estate?" "He sold the Hamptons house," I confirmed. Blackwood let out a low whistle that escaped his lips. "That is bold even for him. Does he know?" "He knows absolutely nothing," I said, a cold smile forming. "He thinks he is a millionaire. He thinks he is a real estate tycoon. He thinks I am currently packing a suitcase for a terrible nursing home in Queens." Silence on the line, then Blackwood chuckled. It was a dark, highly dangerous sound, So what is the exact play, Garrison? Do we stop the transfer? Do we call the federal authorities right now? No, I said firmly. I looked down at the red file at the photo of Vanessa smiling radiantly on a yacht in Miami, a yacht that belonged to her second ex-husband, the one she had systematically bankrupted. Not yet, I said. He wants to be a big shot. He wants to stand up at his wedding tomorrow at the plaza and aggressively brag about his empire. I want him to taste the vintage champagne. I want him to feel the immense weight of the gold in his pocket. I paused, my hand tightening on the phone. And then, when he is at the very top of the mountain, when he is looking down on everyone thinking he has won the world, I want to violently push him off. Understood, Blackwoods said. Protocol 7, I confirmed Protocol 7 was the nuclear option. It was a brutal strategy we had devised years ago for a case involving a highly corrupt CEO who had stolen his employees' pension funds. It involved total asset freezing, catastrophic public exposure, and simultaneous criminal prosecution. It was strictly designed to not just stop an opponent, but to completely obliterate them. I want the entire team ready at the plaza tomorrow, I said. I want the forensic accounting report finalized. And Blackwood, yes, bring the Bentley. I am completely done with this wheelchair. I hung up the phone and snapped it shut. I tossed it onto the granite counter. I walked back to the window. The storm was rapidly picking up intensity. Rain lashed heavily against the glass. My son had made his final choice. He had chosen money over blood. He had chosen a manipulative woman who saw him as an ATM over the father who had raised him. He had chosen to discard me like trash. He genuinely thought the game was over. He thought he had checkmated the king. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who was about to have the last terrible laugh. Tomorrow, at the society wedding of the year, my son was going to learn a very painful, irreversible lesson about finance. He was going to learn the stark difference between ownership and stewardship. He was going to learn that a power of attorney is a powerful tool, but it is completely useless against an irrevocable trust with a life estate clause. He thought he sold my house. He thought he stole my money. He had actually just committed federal wire fraud and sold a property he did not legally own to a highly dangerous criminal organization. I laughed again. This time it wasn't dry, it was ice cold. Enjoy your wedding night. Bradley, I whispered to the storm, because the honeymoon is going to be in a federal prison. I turned away from the window. I had work to do. I had to pack, not for a nursing home, but for a war. I needed to find the charcoal suit I had meticulously hidden in the back of the closet, the one Bradley hadn't found to sell. I walked through the empty house, my footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood floors. For the first time since Catherine died, I didn't feel lonely. I felt entirely focused. The old Garrison was back, and he was starving. The rain hadn't stopped. It beat relentlessly against the flickering neon sign of Joe's all-night diner in Queens, creating a rhythmic thrumming that matched the pounding in my temples. This was the kind of depressing place where dreams came to officially die over plates of greasy eggs and lukewarm coffee. It was deeply fitting. Tonight, I was burying the last fragile dream I had left, the dream that my son was a decent man who had simply lost his way. I sat in the corner booth, my back firmly to the wall, a paranoid habit from a lifetime spent looking over my shoulder. I wasn't wearing the stained sweatpants of the invalid anymore. I was wearing my charcoal Brooks Brothers suit, the exact one I had worn to testify before Congress in 1998. It smelled slightly of mothballs, but it fit like armor. The bell above the diner door jingled. Blackwood walked in. He didn't look like the senior partner of a white-shoe law firm. He wore a trench coat that had seen much better days, and a fedora pulled low. He carried a heavy leather briefcase that looked large enough to contain a body. He slid into the booth opposite me without a single word. The waitress, a tired woman named Mabel, who had been working here since the Nixon administration, poured him a mug of black coffee and just left the pot. "You look good for a dead man," Blackwood grunted, taking a sip of the dark sludge. "I feel completely dead," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "What do you have?" He didn't waste time. He hoisted the heavy briefcase onto the table and clicked the brass latches. The sound echoed loudly in the empty diner like a gunshot. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, tightly paper-clipped together, and slid them across the formica table. "I have spent 40 years aggressively dissecting financial corpses," Blackwood said. his eyes hard as flint. But this is an absolute massacre. I put on my reading glasses. I didn't need them to see the truth, but I needed them to see the brutal details. I was a forensic auditor. That wasn't just a job title on a resume. It was exactly who I was. For 3 decades, I relentlessly hunted the kind of men who destroy global economies. I tracked cartel money through the labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I found the deeply hidden ledgers that sent CEOs to federal prison. I could look at a spreadsheet and instantly smell the fear in the numbers. I looked at Bradley's financials, and the stench was overwhelming. It wasn't an investment portfolio. It was an active crime scene. Page 1. The $500,000 he had aggressively drained from my decoy accounts yesterday. I traced the wire transfer instantly. It hadn't gone to a startup incubator. It hadn't gone to a high-yield savings account. It had been systematically broken up into 20 smaller transfers, all routed heavily to offshore gambling sites and crypto wallets that were clearly Ponzi schemes. He didn't steal your money to build a legitimate business, Blackwood said softly. He stole it to stop the bleeding. I flipped the page, credit card statements, pages and pages of them, all maxed out, cash advances taken at a predatory 28% interest. And then, the massive recurring payments to a shell company called North Star Logistics. North Star Logistics, I muttered. That sounds familiar, it should, Blackwood said grimly. It is a known front for Mickey the Shark. I froze completely. Mickey the Shark was absolutely not a nickname you wanted to see on your son's bank statement. He was a brutal loan shark who operated out of the back of a butcher shop in Hell's Kitchen. He didn't send overdue notices. He sent huge men with baseball bats, $200,000. I read the figure aloud. It tasted like ash in my mouth. My son officially owes a loan shark $200,000. That is strictly the principal, Blackwood corrected. The VIG is running at 5% a week. He is drowning, Garrison. That is exactly why he sold the house so fast. That is why he took the lowball cash offer. He wasn't trying to screw you over for pure profit. He was trying to save his own kneecaps. I stared blankly at the numbers. The red ink blurred for a second. I vividly remembered Bradley at 10 years old crying because he lost his weekly allowance. I had given him more, wanting to teach him that mistakes could be fixed. I had taught him the completely wrong lesson. I had taught him that there was always a bailout. This entirely explains the urgency, I said, closing the folder sharply. It explains why he couldn't wait for me to die naturally. Mickey doesn't wait for biology, there is more, Blackwood said. He slid a second, significantly thinner folder across the table. I opened it. It was a copy of the sales contract for the Hamptons house. I scanned the terms. It was infinitely worse than I thought. It wasn't just a quick sale. It was a quitclaim deed transferred immediately to a holding company registered in Delaware. Who is the real buyer? I asked. A man named Vinnie Moretti. Blackwood said. I knew the name immediately. Moretti was a highly dangerous fixer for the tri-state mob. He bought distressed properties for pure cash, used them heavily for money laundering or safe houses, and then flipped them. He wasn't a man who checked title insurance. He was a man who expected to get exactly what he paid for. Bradley sold a house he doesn't actually own to the mob, I said, a cold, bitter laugh escaping my lips. He took $1.5 million from Vinnie Moretti for a property that legally belongs to the Catherine Garrison Revocable Trust, and he just spent $500,000 of it, paying off Mickey. Blackwood nodded. So even if he wanted to quickly refund the money when the deal inevitably goes south, he can't. He is incredibly short. The sheer magnitude of my son's stupidity was breathtaking. He had somehow managed to defraud his father, the federal government, and the Italian mafia all in the exact same week. He had lit a match in a room full of dynamite and was currently planning to celebrate the explosion at his wedding. I closed the file. The auditor in me completely took over. The grieving father was gone, replaced by the man who had stared down Enron executives. This wasn't a family tragedy anymore, it was a case, and I knew exactly how to close a case. He is not just a thief, I said, my voice incredibly steady. He is a massive liability. If Vinnie Moretti finds out he has been severely scammed, he won't sue. He will come for blood. And since Bradley used your power of attorney, Blackwood pointed out, technically, you are the one who sold it. Vinnie will come for you first. Let him come, I said, my eyes cold. I will deal with Moretti. He is a businessman, he understands leverage. But Bradley needs to be neutralized. He is dangerous to himself, to me, to absolutely anyone he touches. I looked at the coffee in my mug. It was completely cold. He thinks he is a king, I whispered. He thinks he has won the lottery. He is walking into the plaza tomorrow, feeling like he owns the world. And you are going to show him he owns nothing, Blackwood said. I am going to show him the ledger, I corrected. I am going to balance the books. I looked at Blackwood. What about the girl, Vanessa? Blackwood reached deeply into his briefcase again. He pulled out a large glossy photograph and a comprehensive DNA report. You were completely right, he said. She is not a 28-year-old art student. Her real name is Veronica Miller. She is 32. She has 2 ex-husbands in Florida. Both filed for massive bankruptcy within a year of marrying her. She has a record for check fraud in Tallahassee that was sealed but not expunged. I looked closely at the photo. It was a mugshot. The hair was different, less blonde, less polished, but the eyes were exactly the same. Predatory, cold, calculating, and the baby? I asked. Dreading the answer, Blackwood tapped the DNA report. I got the sample from the hairbrush you swiped from her vanity when she stayed over last month. We ran it against Bradley's toothbrush. 0% probability of paternity, Blackwood said, his voice flat. The baby isn't his. We ran a secondary match against known criminal databases. It belongs to her personal trainer in Miami, a guy named Rico. I leaned back in the vinyl booth. The picture was entirely complete. My son was a pathetic patsy, a mark. He was being aggressively played by a professional con artist, leveraged by a brutal loan shark, and hunted by the mob. And he had actively betrayed the only person who could have saved him. He had sold his mother's house to pay for a life that was a complete lie from top to bottom. I felt a strange sense of absolute calm settle over me. It was the calm of the executioner. The lingering doubt was gone. The hesitation was gone. There was absolutely no moral ambiguity here. Bradley wasn't a victim. He was a willing co-conspirator in his own destruction. I checked my watch. It was 2 a.m. In just 10 hours, the wedding would begin. In 10 hours, Bradley would stand at the altar and promise to love and cherish a woman who was already meticulously planning his bankruptcy. We have enough, I said, gathering the heavy files. We have enough to send them both away for 20 years. We do, Blackwood agreed, but how exactly do you want to play it? We could call the FBI right now. They could easily arrest him at the rehearsal breakfast. No, I said, standing up. That is far too private. That is way too easy. He humiliated me. He treated me like a piece of furniture to be quickly sold. He made me feel utterly useless. I want him to deeply feel what it is like to lose absolutely everything when the whole world is watching. I buttoned my tailored jacket. The fabric felt incredibly good against my skin, solid. Real, I want the screen, I said. At the reception, it is successfully hacked. Blackwood confirmed. My tech guy has complete control of the AV system. We can broadcast whatever we want. Good. Load the hidden video from the library camera, the one where they laugh about putting me in the state home. And load the wire transfer records and the DNA test. I picked up the files. I am going to give a father's toast. Blackwood, it is going to be the speech of a lifetime. We walked out of the diner into the freezing rain. The city was asleep, completely unaware of the massive storm that was brewing in a penthouse at the plaza. I got into the passenger seat of Blackwood's Bentley. As we drove towards Manhattan, I wasn't just Garrison the father anymore. I wasn't just Garrison the retiree. I was the auditor, and tomorrow I was going to conduct the final review. The numbers were in, the deficit was total, and it was time to rapidly foreclose. I sat in the plush leather back seat of the Bentley as the city lights blurred past the rain-streaked windows. Blackwood drove in total silence, giving me the space I needed to digest the rest of the file. The folder lay heavy on my lap, a paper tombstone for the woman my son was about to enthusiastically marry. I turned on the small reading light overhead. It cast a harsh yellow glow on the glossy photograph of Veronica Miller. In the photo Bradley had sent me months ago, she was radiant. She looked like innocence personified, the struggling art student who had captured my son's heart with her creativity. But the photo in my hands now was different. It was a surveillance shot taken 5 years ago in a Miami nightclub. She was wearing diamonds that cost more than a teacher's salary. Her arm draped around a man who looked 20 years her senior. Her eyes weren't soft, they were scanning the room, instantly calculating the net worth of every man in her vicinity. I flipped the page to her biography. It read like a manual on how to systematically destroy a human being. Husband number 1, Gary Swanson, a retired architect in Fort Lauderdale. He met her at a charity gala. 6 months later, they were married without a prenup. 1 year later, Gary filed for divorce. By then, his retirement fund was completely gone, drained into shell companies she controlled. Gary now lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and worked as a greeter at a hardware store. Husband number 2, Michael DeLuca, a restaurateur in Chicago. She convinced him to leverage his businesses to expand. She put her name on the massive loans, but kept her name entirely off the liabilities. When the expansion failed suspiciously fast, she walked away with the liquid assets, leaving him with the crippling debt. Michael had been found unconscious in his car in a closed garage, the engine running. He survived, but he was a completely broken man. She was a black widow who didn't even need poison. She used affection as a neurotoxin. She isolated her victims, turning them aggressively against their families, making them believe she was the only person who truly understood them. I had seen her do it to Bradley. Mom and Dad don't understand our vision. She would whisper to him at dinner, thinking I couldn't hear. They are stuck in the past, we are the future. She had severed the cord between father and son with a scalpel made of sweet words. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, sealed plastic bag holding the single blonde hair. The DNA report proved the child she was carrying was a lie. It was just another prop in her stage play, the child of a drug dealer, passed off as the heir to the Garrison estate. I felt a cold fury settle deeply in my chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the blood. She had tried to graft a lie onto my family tree. I turned my attention to the second stack of documents. The real estate contract Bradley had signed 24 hours ago. Sale price. One tire, $500. It was a terrible insult. We had bought it for $2 million in the 1990s. It was officially appraised at $4 million last year. Bradley had sold it for scrap. He had sold my memories, my sanctuary, my wife's garden, for pennies on the dollar. I flipped to the addendum on page 4. This was the exact clause that made my blood run completely cold. Immediate possession. The seller agrees to vacate the premises by 8 a.m. The property is sold as is, with all contents included. All contents included. My stomach violently twisted. Bradley hadn't just sold the house. He had sold absolutely everything inside it. My books, my clothes, Catherine's grand piano, the photos of his own childhood. He hadn't bothered to pack a single box. He had just walked out, locked the door, and handed the keys to a mobster, leaving 40 years of our family history to be thrown into a dumpster by Vinnie Moretti's crew. Why? I asked the empty air in the car. Why the fire sale? Blackwood didn't speak. He just pointed a calloused finger at the other stack of papers. The bank statements. The payments to North Star Logistics totaled $40,000 in just 3 months. And yet, the principal hadn't moved. Bradley wasn't paying down the loan. He was strictly paying the interest. He was aggressively treading water in a sea of gasoline. The $500,000 he had stolen yesterday had gone straight to North Star. He had stolen it because Mickey the Shark had likely given him a deadline that dangerously coincided with his wedding day. Because here was the detail Bradley had completely missed. The house didn't actually belong to Thomas Garrison. 10 years ago, Catherine and I had put the house into a trust. The Catherine Garrison Revocable Trust, and the deed had a specific clause, a life estate. It meant that as long as I was alive, I had the sole undisputed right to live in that house. It meant that the house could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the explicit signature of the trustee. And Bradley was absolutely not the trustee. Blackwood was. The power of attorney Bradley held gave him absolutely no authority over the trust property. He had sold a house he did not own. We are going to the plaza, I told Blackwood. I am not going there to stop a wedding. I am going there to conduct a liquidation. The Bentley pulled over to the curb on 58th Street, just around the corner from the main entrance of the Plaza Hotel. The rain had turned into a freezing drizzle that coated the city in a sheen of gray misery. It was the absolute perfect weather for a tragedy, or in my case, a performance. Blackwood killed the engine. He didn't say a word. He just got out, retrieved the wheelchair from the spacious trunk, and unfolded it on the wet pavement. I stepped out of the luxury car and lowered myself heavily into the seat. It felt familiar now, this throne of deception. I draped a moth-eaten wool blanket over my legs, the same one I used to keep in the trunk for roadside emergencies. I messed up my hair, letting the wind catch the thinning gray strands, until I looked like a man who had slept under a bridge. I slumped my shoulders, curving my spine into the question mark of the defeated. I looked at my reflection in the side mirror of the Bentley. Garrison the auditor was entirely gone. In his place sat a discard, a remnant, a father who had been chewed up and spat out by his own progeny. Blackwood handed me a small piece of cardboard. "Go get them," he whispered, before getting back into the car to drive it to the garage, leaving me entirely alone on the sidewalk. I placed my hands on the rims of the wheels. They were cold, slick with rain. I began to push. The Plaza Hotel loomed massively above me, a fortress of limestone and extreme luxury. The golden light spilling from its revolving doors looked like the entrance to heaven, but I knew that inside, hell was actively in session. Doormen in expensive livery stood guard, their eyes scanning for wealthy guests and aggressively filtering out the unwanted. I was the very definition of unwanted. I rolled up the ramp, my wheels squeaking loudly against the stone. One of the doormen stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of polite dismissal. "Sir, you cannot be here," he said, his voice firm but low. "This is highly private property." I looked up at him, deliberately letting my jaw slacken, letting my eyes completely lose focus. I didn't speak to him. I spoke right through him. "My son," I rasped, my voice cracking perfectly. "My son is getting married, Bradley Garrison." The doorman hesitated, the name registered. The Garrison wedding was the main, incredibly expensive event today. It was the reason the grand ballroom was entirely closed off. He looked at my wet rags. He looked at my squeaky wheelchair. He looked at the profound desperation etched into my face. He didn't see a threat. He saw a massive scandal. And in a hotel like the Plaza, you handle scandals by rapidly moving them out of sight. "I just want to see him," I whispered. "Just one look." He tapped his earpiece, muttering something about a situation, but I didn't wait for permission. I aggressively pushed forward, the wheelchair bumping over the threshold of the revolving door. The immense warmth of the lobby hit me like a physical blow. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. The hum of conversation rapidly died down as I rolled onto the pristine marble floor. I was an ink stain on a white sheet. I could heavily feel the eyes of the hotel guests on me. The intense judgment, the pity, the absolute disgust, I aggressively fed on it. I let it fuel the character I was playing. I navigated through the massive lobby, following the ornate signs for the grand ballroom. I knew exactly where to go. I took the elevator down to the reception level. The doors opened, and the noise of the party washed over me. It was a loud symphony of extreme excess. A live orchestra was playing a waltz, the clinking of crystal glasses, the roar of laughter. I rolled down the hallway, the thick carpet muffling the sound of my approach. The double doors to the ballroom were completely open. Security was lax. Why wouldn't it be? Who would ever crash a wedding like this? I stopped at the entrance and looked inside. It was breathtaking, and it was deeply sickening. My money was literally everywhere. It was in the thousands of white orchids cascading from the ceiling, a floral arrangement that likely cost $50,000. It was in the towering ice sculpture of a swan in the center of the massive seafood buffet. It was in the rivers of Dom Perignon flowing into flutes held by people I had never even met. And there, in the center of the packed dance floor, was my son. Bradley looked magnificent. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo that fit him perfectly, hiding the softness of a man who had never done a single day of manual labor. He was laughing, his head thrown back, holding a glass of champagne. He looked like a man who believed he had completely gotten away with murder. Next to him was Vanessa, or Veronica. She was wearing a wedding dress that was significantly more diamonds than fabric. It hugged her body, showing off the baby bump that she cradled protectively with one hand. The fake air, she was beaming, perfectly playing the role of the blushing bride. She looked at Bradley with a gaze that simulated total adoration, so well it was almost terrifying. I gripped the wheels, my knuckles turned stark white. This was it, the moment of impact. I aggressively pushed myself into the ballroom. I didn't yell, I didn't make a scene immediately. I just rolled, slowly, methodically. I rolled past the tables where guests were feasting on filet mignon. I rolled past the open bar where the bartender froze mid-pour. The ripple effect started aggressively at the back of the room. Conversations rapidly stopped, heads turned, forks paused halfway to mouths. The silence spread like a contagion, moving from the outer tables toward the center of the room. The music faltered as the conductor suddenly noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The violins trailed off into a discordant scratch. Within 30 seconds, the massive room was entirely silent. 500 wealthy people were staring at the ragged, wet, old man in the wheelchair in the middle of the aisle. Bradley turned. He felt the immense weight of the silence. His smile didn't just fade. It evaporated. The blood violently drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the sheer terror of a child caught stealing. His eyes darted around the room, desperately looking for an exit, looking for an excuse. Vanessa turned a second later. Her reaction was entirely different. She didn't look scared. She looked absolutely furious. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits, her jaw aggressively clenched. She looked at me not as a person, but as a stain on her dress, a complication she thought she had permanently disposed of. I stopped the wheelchair 10 feet away from the head table. I let my hands shake violently as I reached out toward them. "Bradley," I croaked. The silence in the room amplified my weak voice. It carried heavily to the rafters. "I am hungry, son." A loud gasp went through the room, a collective intake of breath from the high society of New York. The guests looked from the old man in the dirty blanket to the groom in the $3,000 tuxedo. Bradley took a step forward, then stopped. He didn't know what to do. If he kicked me out, he was a massive monster. If he acknowledged me, his lie of the self-made man completely crumbled. He was paralyzed by his own massive vanity. "Dad," he hissed, his voice a desperate whisper that tried to be private but failed. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be away." "I couldn't pay, Bradley," I whined, perfectly playing the confusion card. "They wouldn't let me in. You took the money, Bradley, you took it all." The aggressive whispers started then, like the buzzing of 1,000 angry bees. The guests were heavily leaning in, exchanging shocked glances. Vanessa stepped in front of Bradley. She was the shield. She was the general. She knew the optics were collapsing, and she had to salvage the scene. She walked toward me, her heels clicking loudly on the parquet floor. She didn't look compassionate. She looked exactly like a predator assessing a wounded animal. She crouched down next to my wheelchair, putting herself at my eye level. To the room, it looked like a lovely gesture of kindness. It looked like the bride comforting the confused elder. She placed a hand on my knee. Her perfectly manicured nails dug painfully into my skin through the blanket. "You old fool," she whispered, her voice low and incredibly venomous, completely masked by a sweet, fake smile she projected to the room. "You just couldn't die quietly, could you? You had to come here and ruin my moment." I looked at her. I deliberately let a single tear roll down my cheek. It was easy. I just had to deeply think about the hairbrush I had stolen and the DNA test sitting in the file outside. "I have nowhere to go," I said loudly, projecting my voice so the entire ballroom could hear. "He sold the house, he threw me out." Vanessa stood up abruptly. She turned to the crowd, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Everyone, please forgive this incredibly unfortunate interruption. My father-in-law is suffering from advanced dementia. He is severely confused. We have been trying to get him the medical help he desperately needs, but he wandered off from his care facility." She gestured to the security guards who were now cautiously approaching the aisle. "Please escort him to a quiet room. Bradley will deal with this shortly." 2 large men in black suits reached for the handles of my wheelchair. "Don't touch me," I said. My voice was no longer weak. It was no longer the confused rasp of a senile old man. It was the sharp, commanding bark of a man who was used to giving orders and having them immediately obeyed. The guards actually stopped. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of the wheelchair. I didn't struggle. I simply stood up. I stood to my full height, towering over Vanessa. I straightened my charcoal suit jacket. I kicked the moth-eaten wool blanket away. It landed in a puddle of spilled champagne on the marble floor. The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening. Bradley took a massive step backward, bumping into the ice sculpture. A piece of the swan shattered and crashed to the floor. Dementia is a terrible, terrifying disease, Vanessa, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. It steals your memories, it steals your dignity, but there is one thing it does not steal. It does not steal your ability to read a bank statement. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I pointed it at the massive AV booth at the back of the room. I pressed the button. The lights in the ballroom instantly dimmed. The music cut out completely. Behind the head table, a massive white projection screen slowly descended from the ceiling, covering the wall of white orchids. "What is going on?" Bradley shouted, his voice finally breaking. "Turn the lights back on. Security, get him out of here." But security wasn't moving. Blackwood had already paid the head of security, a very handsome retainer, to stand down for precisely 10 minutes. The projector flared to life. The massive screen illuminated the dark room. "Let's talk about confusion." "Bradley," I said, turning to face the 500 guests. "My son claims I am confused, so I would like to clarify a few things for the entire room. First, let's talk about real estate." A document flashed onto the screen. It was the sales contract for the Hamptons mansion. "Yesterday morning, my son, using a power of attorney he completely manipulated out of me, sold my home to a man named Vinnie Moretti for $1.5 million in cash. I am sure there are a few people in this room who recognize that name." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Moretti was a known entity in certain New York circles, and not the kind of entity you wanted to invite to a wedding. "The problem," I continued, pacing slowly in front of the head table, "is that Bradley didn't actually own the house. And neither did I. The house is held in an irrevocable trust with a life estate clause. The power of attorney he held gave him absolutely zero legal authority to sell it." I stopped and looked directly at Bradley. He was sweating profusely. "You sold a piece of property you did not own. Bradley, that is federal wire fraud, but more importantly, you took $1.5 million from the tri-state mob for a deed that is completely worthless. I imagine Mr. Moretti is going to be incredibly confused when he tries to move his people into my house tomorrow morning and finds my lawyer waiting for him with a federal injunction." "Dad, stop!" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking. "Turn it off. You are ruining everything." "I am just getting started," I said coldly. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. It showed the bank statements, the massive red numbers glowing brightly in the dark. "Let's talk about the $500,000 you drained from my retirement accounts yesterday," I said. "You told me you needed startup capital, but the money didn't go to a startup, did it?" I clicked the remote again. The payments to North Star Logistics filled the screen. "It went to Mickey the Shark," I announced to the silent room. "A loan shark operating out of Hell's Kitchen. You owe him $200,000 in principal, and you were desperately paying the VIG to keep him from breaking your legs. You stole my money, Bradley, to pay a violent criminal because you are a degenerate gambler." The guests were visibly recoiling. People were physically stepping away from the head table, as if Bradley were highly contagious. He was ruined. His reputation in New York society was completely, irreparably destroyed. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Vanessa. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the exit doors. She was calculating her escape route. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "let's talk about the blushing bride." I clicked the remote. The mugshot of Veronica Miller filled the massive screen. The guests gasped loudly. "Vanessa Carter, or should I say Veronica Miller," I announced. 32 years old, 2 previous marriages in Florida and Chicago. Both husbands completely bankrupted within a year. A sealed record for check fraud. "You son of a bitch," Vanessa hissed, dropping the sweet facade entirely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. She lunged forward, raising her hand to slap me. I caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was like iron. She gasped in pain. "Don't ever try to touch me again," I said, dropping her arm as if it were diseased. I clicked the remote one last time. The DNA report flashed onto the screen. The big, bold zeros at the bottom were highlighted in bright yellow. "Probability of paternity, 0%, I read aloud. I turned to my son, who was openly weeping now, his face buried in his hands. "The baby isn't yours, Bradley. The DNA was tested against a known database. The father is a personal trainer and convicted drug dealer from Miami." Bradley looked up, his eyes bloodshot, staring at Vanessa in total disbelief. "Is it true?" He choked out, "Tell me it isn't true." Vanessa didn't even look at him, she looked at me. "You are a dead man," she spat. "Vinnie Moretti is going to kill you. Vinnie Moretti is a businessman," I replied calmly. "When he finds out the money he gave Bradley was immediately funneled to Mickey the Shark, he won't be coming after me. The mob and the loan sharks are going to have a very interesting conversation about who gets to keep the cash. And they are both going to be looking directly at Bradley to make up the difference." I turned my back on them and looked at the crowd. "I apologize for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen," I said. "Please enjoy the extremely expensive champagne. I paid for it." I walked back down the aisle. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody said a word. The silence was absolute. As I reached the massive double doors, they swung open violently. 4 uniformed NYPD officers and 2 men in plainclothes FBI windbreakers walked in. Blackwood was right behind them, holding a thick stack of warrants. "Bradley Garrison and Veronica Miller," the lead FBI agent announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "You are both under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit fraud." I walked past the agents. I didn't look back as the handcuffs clicked shut. I didn't look back as Vanessa started screaming obscenities. I didn't look back as my son collapsed onto the marble floor, sobbing hysterically. I walked out into the cool, damp air of the New York night. Blackwood's Bentley was waiting at the curb. "You want a ride home, Garrison?" Blackwood asked, leaning against the car. "Yes," I said. "I am going home. 3 months later, the Hamptons house is quiet again. But it is a good quiet. It is the peace that comes after a violent storm has finally passed." The trial was incredibly short. The forensic evidence was completely irrefutable. Bradley pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence, but he still got 8 years in federal prison. He is currently sitting in a cell, trying to figure out how to survive without a trust fund or a bailout. Veronica fought the charges, claiming she was manipulated by Bradley. The judge didn't buy a single word of it. Her previous victims came forward to testify. She was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security facility. The child was placed in the custody of the state, a tragic innocent casualty in a war of profound greed. The money Bradley gave to Mickey, the shark, was seized by the FBI as evidence in a much larger RICO case. Vinnie Moretti realized he had been conned and cut his losses, completely abandoning the fake real estate deal. The house remained exactly where it always belonged, in the trust. I sit on the back patio, drinking my black coffee, watching the Atlantic Ocean churn against the shore. The weather is clear today. We are often told that family is sacred. We are conditioned to believe that we must endure any amount of disrespect, any amount of theft, simply because the person hurting us shares our DNA. But blood is not a license to abuse. True family is built on respect, on gratitude, on a foundation of mutual trust. When someone treats you like a burden, when they look at your life and only see a bank account waiting to be drained, you owe them absolutely nothing. I spent my entire life auditing ledgers, searching for the truth hidden in the numbers. But the most important audit I ever conducted was the audit of my own life. I found the fraud, I exposed the lie, and I balanced the books. Never let anyone convince you that your age makes you weak. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a vulnerability. And never, ever hand over the keys to your life to someone who hasn't proven they know how to drive. Because the moment you give up your power, you give up your dignity. And dignity is a price no one should ever be forced to pay. The aftermath of that single night at the Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in total systemic collapse. You don't just defraud the tri-state mob, a ruthless Hell's Kitchen loan shark, and the federal government all at once and expect to simply walk away. Bradley thought he was playing a high-stakes game of Monopoly. He didn't realize the board was rigged with high explosives, and he was the one holding the match. The trial itself was less of a legal battle and more of a highly publicized financial autopsy. The federal prosecutors didn't even have to work hard. Blackwood and I handed them a perfectly wrapped package of airtight forensic evidence. The wire transfers, the forged power of attorney signatures, the DNA reports, the offshore crypto accounts. It was all there in black and white. Bradley's highly expensive defense lawyer tried to paint him as a tragic, easily manipulated victim of a professional con artist. He claimed Bradley was blinded by love and desperately trying to provide for a child he believed was his own. The jury didn't buy a single word of it. They looked at the bank records, showing that Bradley had stolen my money to fund his gambling addiction long before Vanessa even entered the picture. They saw a man who would gladly sell his own father into a squalid nursing home just to save his own skin. When the judge handed down the 8-year sentence in federal prison, Bradley didn't look at me. He kept his eyes firmly glued to the floor, finally crushed under the immense weight of his own profound arrogance. I heard through Blackwood that federal prison has not been kind to him. Without his trust fund, without his tailored suits, and without his father's money to bail him out, he is nothing. He is just a number in a cell, desperately trying to survive in a world where true leverage is measured in physical violence, not credit limits. Vanessa or Veronica Miller faced a significantly harsher reality. The judge made an absolute example out of her. 15 years in a maximum security facility without the possibility of early parole. The sheer audacity of her crimes preying on the elderly, forging medical documents, bank fraud, and identity theft made her a pariah even among the prison population. But the most tragic casualty of their mutual greed was the unborn child. When the baby was born, it was immediately placed into the custody of the state. Rico Silva, the personal trainer and biological father, was already serving time in a Florida penitentiary on federal drug trafficking charges. He had absolutely zero interest in claiming a child. The baby was absorbed into the foster care system, a completely innocent life forever marked by the catastrophic, selfish decisions of a woman who viewed motherhood strictly as a financial strategy. As for the money Bradley handed over to Mickey the Shark, it never saw the light of day again. The FBI seized the entire operation, using the paper trail I provided to dismantle Mickey's loan sharking syndicate from the ground up. Mickey and his enforcers were indicted under the RICO Act. Vinnie Moretti, the mobster who thought he was getting a steal on a Hamptons mansion, realized very quickly that he had been conned by an idiot. When Blackwood presented him with the undeniable legal proof of the irrevocable trust and the life estate clause, Moretti simply cut his losses and walked away. He knew better than to fight a battle he couldn't win, especially when the FBI was already swarming the case. The fake real estate deal dissolved into thin air. My house, Catherine's house, remained exactly where it always belonged. Safe, secure, untouched by the greedy hands of ungrateful children. I often sit on the back patio now, drinking my black coffee and watching the Atlantic Ocean relentlessly churn against the shore. The weather is crisp and clear today, the air smelling strongly of salt and freedom. We are often conditioned by society to believe that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are told that we must blindly endure any amount of disrespect, any amount of theft, and any amount of emotional abuse simply because the person hurting us happens to share our DNA. But blood is absolutely not a license to abuse. True family is not an entitlement, it is a profound privilege. It is built strictly on respect, on profound gratitude, and on a solid foundation of mutual trust. When someone treats you like a heavy burden, when they look at your lifetime of hard work and only see a bank account waiting to be drained, you owe them absolutely nothing. I spent my entire adult life meticulously auditing ledgers, searching for the harsh truth heavily hidden in the numbers. But the most important audit I ever conducted was the aggressive audit of my own life. I found the fraud, I exposed the terrible lie, and I ruthlessly balanced the books. Never let anyone convince you that your advanced age makes you weak. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a fatal vulnerability. And never ever hand over the administrative keys to your life to someone who hasn't proven they know how to drive. Because the exact moment you willingly give up your power, you give up your dignity. And your personal dignity is an incredibly high price that no one should ever be forced to pay.